Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, December 20th, the day of the CFP, and we have a ton to get to today. We're going to start talking about the month of December in college football. It's been a hot topic for probably the last couple of weeks in the world of college football. Want to break it down for you guys, give you guys a reason why it just has to be fixed one way or the other. Then we'll get to the transfer portal. We have about a million things to get to, so we'll fly through that relatively quickly. The biggest one of the bunch is John Mateer on his way to Oklahoma, but it was a little bit tougher than some of the Sooner fans thought it was going to be. Then we'll get to a couple of X Factors that I have for this upcoming weekend for all of the teams playing this weekend. We did X Factor players earlier in this week. Want to make sure I do just X Factors overall for the team. We'll get to a couple of questions I have as we head in, including just how big of an advantage will home field be. And then we'll get to a little bit of a weekend roundup, and we'll talk about Carson Beck missing the rest of the year. We'll talk about the Diego Pavia verdict, a lot of different things that have happened throughout this week. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that. We can have fun back and forth, and always good for the both of us. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about the December calendar, because it's a problem. I think we all understand at this point that it is a problem. It's been a problem for the last couple of years, but especially the last 2 years. It really has felt like it's been at the forefront of college football. A couple of players have had to leave their teams a little bit early for the playoff, especially with this year, and we're talking about Beau Pribula here. And that's kind of the center of this conversation. That's when this conversation, at least this year, when it really started to kick into high gear. We have the transfer portal coming alive. We have the CFP starting tonight at 8 p.m. We have a ton of coaches moving all over the place. We had signing day a couple of weeks ago. It's just too much stuff. It's too much stuff for all of these coaches. It's too much stuff for all of these players. And we'll start with Beau Pribula. We'll start with his case, because the reality is he was put in an impossible situation. Now, there are some other quarterbacks. Preston Stone, who looks like he could be on his way to Northwestern after this year, is staying with SMU for the playoff. All due respect to Preston Stone, he is not as hot of a commodity as Beau Pribula is. We'll talk about him here in a second in the transfer portal segment, because he's flying around some big-time schools, and that's the reality of his situation. Was certain schools probably got in his ear, which is another issue we have to deal with, obviously, but most likely a couple of coaches, a couple of programs got in his ear, said, if you play in the playoff and get injured, your entire stock is going to go down. And if you play in the playoff and get beyond the semifinal, get to the final, or even get to the semifinal, the window's going to be closed. You're not going to have the ability to jump in, or you'll have the ability to jump in. Will there be a spot for you at one of these major universities that he's traveling around to, like Missouri, Ole Miss, UCF, a couple of these places that the reality is, if he didn't jump in when he did, the spots weren't going to be there, plain and simple. So it's going to be one of those situations where, kind of like Malik Murphy last year, where he had to leave Texas earlier than he probably wanted to, and earlier than almost definitely he wanted to, because that was the reality of the portal at that point. He got the job at Duke. He is now over at Oregon State. We'll talk about that in the next segment as well. But overall, it's a decision that you're putting these kids in just impossible situations. Multiple coaches have spoken about this, including James Franklin, about the issues that come from this, and we have to find a way to fix it. We have to find a way to make sure that these coaches can understand what's going on the daily basis, that these players aren't pushed to make decisions that they're not fully comfortable with, and that the fans don't lose the love that they have for this game. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've talked to a number of people throughout my life that have just said, it's getting a little bit tough to really enjoy my team year over year, because some of these kids just aren't staying for as long as you want them to. So it's one of those situations. We have to figure out the best way forward, that you put the kids in the best situation, but you also keep the product that we all love, which is these kids sticking around for as long as possible and being a part of teams growing through year to year. And other than that, leaving out the portal part of this, leaving out the players' rights, quote unquote, part of this, you're losing a lot of the love of bowl games. We had incredible bowl games, this one in particular between West Virginia and Memphis. They got after each other, and Hudson Clement made a ton of really big-time plays, and it was really, really cool to watch him kind of burst onto the scene like that. Not a lot of people know his name today, because not a lot of people were watching. Even West Virginia fans, they were probably a little bit more worried about what Rich Rod was doing in the portal than they were worried about that game. And I don't mean to call out West Virginia fans. This really does apply to just about everyone that's in the bowl game but not in the playoff. we have made it so that the playoff is the only thing that matters. Everyone put your energy there, and whatever happens in bowl season doesn't necessarily matter. Players are going to be moving around, coaches are going to be moving around. There's going to be no real reason for this stuff to be important, so don't care about it. And it's created a really, really bad idea around bowl season where a lot of these guys are lacing them up for the very last time. A lot of these guys are putting on that helmet for the very last time, whether that's for their college or just in general. A lot of these guys, wrap it up after this game, and they don't get necessarily nearly the love that they deserve or the respect that they deserve for getting to that moment. So I fully understand that a lot of this stuff definitely matters. The portal really matters for next year. What coaching hires you make matters. All of that stuff is a huge deal, but bowl games used to mean a ton, and I really want them to continue to mean a ton, and maybe it is, wishful thinking. Maybe it is too far down the path for us to get it back, but the reality is a lot of these kids are lacing them up for the last time, and they absolutely deserve to get a lot of the love that we're giving to a lot of the other players that are playing in the CFP, or some of the players that aren't even playing in bowl games, but they're moving around to new schools. They're getting all the love in the world, while a guy like Hudson Clement goes for over 100 yards in a bowl game, and no one really talks about it the next day. So that's another issue for me. I just want bowl games to mean a little bit more. I know it's a little bit of wishful thinking, but it can happen if we just all put our energy a little bit more towards that direction and fix some of the issues going on in the middle of bowl season. And you add on to this, you have recruiting that has to go on during this month, and a lot of it has been done. It was from the 4th to the 6th, so it wasn't necessarily like they were recruiting deep into December, but it's still a lot to handle. It's still a lot to juggle as you're getting ready for a conference title, as you're possibly getting ready for a playoff or a bowl game. It's a lot to juggle, and Tennessee is a team where, or Texas, or Clemson, or whoever is on has to go on the road this weekend, or has to play at home this weekend, and they can't necessarily focus on all the other things that everyone else is focusing on because they had success. It doesn't make much sense to me. It's definitely a battle between like a million different people, and it won't necessarily be a clean solution. I can't promise that we're going to have this very, very clean break where we'll love everything about it, but something's got to change. So just to give you an idea of what the schedule actually looks like, what the calendar looks like in the month of December, I think the biggest thing to remember here is you start with National Signing Day. That is a multi-month, multi-year effort from a number of different people in that program, especially during the last 2 weeks. It's an absolute nightmare, an absolute frenzy to get all the guys that you need. So that's how you start the month. Then the portal opens the next Monday, after you've played a conference championship, or after, at the very least, you wishing to have played for a conference championship. That goes until the 28th, so it'll be done before the quarterfinals of the CFP. Then you have bowl season, that's smack dab right in the middle of that thing. You have CFP that's starting tonight and will run all the way throughout the next month, and then you have early enrollees that have to come in the first week of January. That's too much for the coaches to deal with. That's too much for the players to deal with. That's too much for the fans to deal with in a lot of respects, and you're losing a lot of fans because of it. We have to find a way to move forward where the coaches are on board, where the players are on board, and it makes sense for them, both from a perspective of we do want to put them in the best situation. We do want to give them a certain amount of power, but also we don't want to give them too much power, because the reality is that's what I feel like has happened in this sport, where we push all this energy over to giving all the kids the power and making sure that they have all the player rights that they could possibly want, and that's a great thing. But the reality is we haven't given them the tools to handle all of the power that we have given them, and it's put them in really bad situations, including Bo Pribula, including a couple of these other kids that are represented by people that just aren't agents, that just don't really know what the situation is or what the market is in this sport. So it has to change one way or the other. And how do we figure this out? What are some of the possible fixes for this? And one of the cleanest ones is just moving the portal window, finding a way to possibly just move it to the spring, have one portal window in the spring. And this has its pros and cons. You obviously would declutter December. It would make it a little bit easier to appreciate bowl games, to appreciate the CFP. You would still have movement for coaching hires and different things like that, but much less movement for sure. There's no doubt about that. But you would also have on the other side, on the on a pro side, the kids would know where they stand in the depth chart after spring camp. The coaches would know what they need in the depth chart in terms of, do we need to go get an extra running back? Do we need to go get a supplementary piece at wide receiver or a DB? All of that stuff would be known at that point, and you would avoid the academic calendar. Obviously, it's not ideal. These kids would not have necessarily quite the ability to jump in winter and then possibly jump back in spring, which is another kind of issue with this system. But the reality is we have to find a way to declutter the month of December the portal's probably the easiest way to do that. And there is some ideas, why are we worrying about the academic schedule at this point? Because, it's pretty much professional football, and I get that argument to a certain extent, but the second we stop worrying about the academic schedule, we're no longer playing college football. So it's a battle back and forth. It's going to be one of those things that people have a lot of arguments for or against it. I tend to be for the idea of just moving it all to the spring and just making it a very clean thing that, yes, some kids will be unhappy. Yes, some kids will have to sit out situations that they don't necessarily love for a couple of months, but then they'll be able to, exercise that right, move forward. But there are some other ideas that are out there, and this is one of the more interesting ones. Moving the bowl games to a possible preseason, to the month of August, and letting you play other teams from other conferences early in the year. Instead of at the very end of the year, you have the portal, you have all of that, but your season effectively ends at the end of the regular season, or if you go to the CFP, great. You continue on throughout the way. And it's interesting. It's one that I'm a little bit kind of on the fence about. I lean towards I'd rather not want this, if I'm being honest. I like bowl season. I like the energy that it brings, and I like the storylines that we have at the end of the year comparative to the beginning of the year. But at the end of the day, you also have a lot of implications to think about. What does this count towards your record once you get into the year? How will we create the matchups? Would it be based off last year, what we project for this year, and what are the scheduling implications for a team that plays on August 7th, and then they play a team in the first week that played on August 21st? Is that really fair? How would that work? That's a ton of other things to think about. And then on top of that, you have to worry about the academic schedule again. So a million things to think about with that respect. I think it's one of those ideas that it's a little bit more up high in the sky than a lot of these other ones, but I do think there is a validity to it. I do think there is an ability to possibly make this happen and make it a relatively good product. I just would lean, moving the portal before I would move bowl games, my personal opinion. And then you could move signing day. That's another one to add. You could possibly move signing day to, you could add one in August where they could sign very early and be set up to enroll early in that school. You could keep the one in February, make that one a bigger one, and just have that one be the only one. This is a tough one. This is one that you're probably not going to get a lot of love from coaches about because they want to have their guys on campus early, and not a lot of guys are ready to sign in August. That's just kind of the reality of recruiting today with a lot of the differences in the way that people work and the way that people operate. It's going to be really tough to get the players, to get the coaches, to get everyone to really sign on to this one. So this one's a little bit more far-fetched than the other two, but there's a solution here. That's the reality of the situation. There is a solution. The reality is also, I don't know what it is because it's so very convoluted. It's so tough to figure out all the different opinions and differing, wants and needs and desires of all the coaches and conferences and everything in between. So it's going to be a battle, but one way or the other, we have to fix this. We have to find a way to move forward in the month of December without these coaches complaining every 2 weeks and without these coaches having to worry about anything but getting their guys ready to play the biggest game of their life. So a lot of different things to think about in the month of December, a lot of different things that need to be moved around, and a lot of things that can really help out a lot of these players and coaches that are struggling right now. But we'll get there. I tend to believe we'll get there. Hopefully we'll get there at the by next year, but if we don't, we'll just continue to fight. We'll hopefully find a solution at some point or another, whether that's moving bowl games to the preseason, moving the transfer portal, playing around with some of the different, contracts and different things in the sport. There are some solutions. It's just going to take a little bit to get there. But we'll break it down as it does, obviously. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we got a million things to talk about from the transfer portal. We'll talk about John Mateer. We'll talk about Malik Murphy. We'll talk about CJ Daniels and a million other players right after this, so stick with us.